We will now talk a little bit about stocks. Now, there is something called common stocks. Well, there's a thing called common stocks, and there are common stocks and preferred stocks. So common stock is financial asset. Financial asset in general means something that pays you money in the future, and you have to pay for it with money today. So common stock is a financial asset which represents partial ownership in a business enterprise. So you get a fraction of ownership of something. It could be a very small fraction. For example, Apple Computer has, I think, billions of shares. So each share represents a very small fraction of ownership of the company. The company is organized as a corporation. Common stock is issued for things that are corporations, which are owned by their shareholders, and corporations are separate legal entities that are created for the purpose of running some business. Because you're an owner of that enterprise, you're entitled to the profits of the enterprise, and a portion of the profits, if you own the stock, that is, then you're entitled. A portion of the profits paid out in cash to the owners is called a dividend. Now, dividends could also be paid from just the cash held by the company, not necessarily profits. Then it's called an extreme case where it's all of the money they have and they just shut down. It's called a liquidating dividend. But that's not a standard procedure. The standard procedure is to pay a portion of the profits as a dividend. And the value of a share of a common stock, one piece, the smallest unit, it can be established by the market if there's an active market for the shares, and the biggest market in the US for that is a stock exchange called New York Stock Exchange, but there are other stock exchanges as well. Or it must be estimated. When it's estimated, we generally assume that the value equals one of these things, either what you can sell the share for right now, so the market again, really, present value of a dividends between now and some specific point in the future when you can sell your share, together with the present value of the share's future sale price, or present value of dividends paid into the infinite future time horizon. Now for common stocks, if the company is growing, then the profits are growing and generally dividends increase over time. There is another type of fractional ownership of a business enterprise, the preferred stocks, which is designed to typically pay a fixed dividend in perpetuity. And of course, the value of that is just the present value of a perpetuity, but you have to figure out what the interest rate is for discounting. But otherwise, it's pretty simple. Dividends are typically paid at the end of the year, so a typical preferred stock is a perpetuity immediate. And common stock can be viewed as an increasing perpetuity immediate, and usually the dividends are assumed to increase in the geometric progression. Okay, so let's consider a situation like this, where we're trying to value some share of stock as a present value of its future dividends. So if the dividend yield is constant, which is basically the preferred stock case, and dividends D are constant and paid in perpetuity at the end of each year, then the price of this is D over I, where I is an appropriate interest rate. And the duration of this would then be minus the reciprocal of the price. So the reciprocal of D over I is I over D, times the derivative of D over I with respect to I. And of course you can just cancel the D because it's a constant, and you get minus I times the derivative of I to the negative 1, so I times I to the negative 2, so 1 over I. This in fact implies that if the dividend is 1, then the duration of such a unit perpetuity immediate is its price. The Macaulay duration of a level perpetuity immediate is 1 plus I times 1 over I, so it's 1 over D. And it equals to the price of a unit perpetuity due. The Macaulay duration of a unit perpetuity due, on the other hand, is simply the Macaulay duration of a unit perpetuity immediate reduced by 1, because all the money, all the cash flows come exactly 1 year earlier, and that works out to be 1 over I, as you can see here. Also, the duration of a unit perpetuity due is V over I, or 1 over I times 1 plus I. And of course, you're familiar with that because you get duration from Macaulay duration by dividing by 1 plus I. Now consider a stock that pays a dividend of D1 at time 1, D2 at time 2, and in general DT at time t, and assume that its dividend grows at a constant annual effective rate of G. That's the basic model for common stock with a constant growth rate. Assume also that the annual yield rate used for the discounting of dividends is I, and it's got to be that G is less than I, because if something grows at a faster rate than the interest rate used for discounting, then the value of such a security is really infinite. And such securities can't exist, really. The price of a stock is the present value of the dividends paid in perpetuity, so we write this out, and the price is that expression, and you can see that you can write this as D1 over 1 plus I times a sum of an infinite geometric series with the ratio of 1 plus G over 1 plus I. And of course, if that 1 plus G over 1 plus I is more than 1, then this is infinite, so that doesn't make sense. But if 1 plus G over 1 plus I is less than 1, then this is a geometric series that converges, and its sum is 1 over 1 minus 1 plus G over 1 plus I, and if you multiply this out, you get D1, the first dividend at the end of the first year, divided by I minus G. Okay, this is commonly called the dividend discount model formula for the price of a common stock, and they teach this in finance classes. So the duration of the stock then can be calculated as minus 1 over the price times the derivative of the price with respect to the interest rate. We plug in that formula, we take the derivative, and after a little bit of work we get 1 over I minus G. And the Macaulay duration is 1 plus I divided by I minus G. An interesting additional observation in this model is that the dividend yield of the stock, which is the dividend divided by the price, is I minus G, so that the duration of a stock is the reciprocal of its dividend yield under the assumptions of this model. You may have heard, because of the all the trouble that we've had in the real estate market, about so-called short sales of houses. That's actually a different story than short sales of securities, so don't confuse the two. A short sale, in case of selling stocks, bonds, or whatever securities we're dealing with, but most commonly stocks, is a sale of a security which is borrowed from a broker, with that security replaced later by a purchase, and that purchase to return the borrowed stuff is called covering of a short. So you have to borrow it somewhere. You borrow it from a broker, and the broker actually gets it from some other customer's account. So the broker is worried because they have to replace it if the customer they got it from wants it. So to make sure that they can replace it, they require a deposit, which is called a margin deposit, of a certain amount of money, typically 50% of the amount received from the sale of a security. On top of it, there is money received from the sale. That money is also kept by the broker. This margin deposit may or may not earn interest from the broker. The money received from a sale generally does not earn interest. That's an extra protection for the broker, because the broker gets the interest, so that gives them extra money to cover the risk. And that money from the sale is held with the broker until the short sale is covered, meaning that you buy back the stuff if you're the speculator who wants to do a short sale. Now, a short sale creates new supply of a security shorted because somebody out there that had this in the account. It was borrowed from their account, but they still think they have it. They were not told even by the broker about this. And then whoever bought it from a short seller also thinks they have this security. So instead of one owner, there are two. So there's new supply of a security shorted. And if that shorted security pays income, such as a dividend, that income must be produced by the short seller, must be replaced by a short seller because the company only issued one share and now you sold short another one. So the company that pays a dividend for this share will pay only one dividend. You have to produce the second one. In general, the payment that has to be made on a borrowed asset is called the lease rate of that asset, or asset lease rate. And why do people do short selling? Well, speculation most of the time. And there is a special purpose in some bond trading transactions by bond dealers where they use this for financing of some transactions, and hedging, meaning managing the risk that you have. So a very typical question on the exam that asks about short selling is a question of the rate of return received by the short seller. In such a calculation, you should pay careful attention to how much money the short seller spends up front and how much money the short seller gets at the end. That's basically what is telling you what the rate of return is. And the short seller typically puts down the margin deposit, which is typically half, but it will be specified in the problem. It doesn't have to be half of the value of the security shorted, and then at the end, the short seller repurchases the security, pays a certain price. If that is less than the initial sale price, that's a profit, and that profit needs to be compared to the initial outlay of money. However, in the meantime, the short seller may have to pay a dividend, so that dividend has to be subtracted from the profit. The general formula that you need to know for the test for the effective yield earned over the period of investment is P is the profit on the short sale transaction, so sale proceeds, how much money you get from the sale, minus the cost of buying it back to cover the short, plus interest earned on any of the money held with a broker. And as I said, it doesn't have to be positive interest. Sometimes they don't pay it. It will be specified in the problem, minus the dividends that the short seller has to pay. And you may have to adjust all of these things if they don't happen at the same time, and it gets more complicated then. Until now, I've been telling you about short selling through a registered broker. In a situation like this, the margin requirement is imposed by government regulation. But short selling can also be arranged as a private transaction in which you borrow an asset privately, sell it, and promise to return it in the future to the owner from whom you borrowed it. This creates a risk to the owner that you will renege on the obligation to return the borrowed property. So in order to manage that risk, the owner can hold the funds obtained from the short sale until you return the property. But even that may not be enough due to price fluctuations of the asset. So the owner, because if the asset goes up in price, they would have to repurchase it at higher price. So the owner may ask the short seller to provide an extra amount, which is like the margin deposit. In the case of such a private transaction, that extra amount is called a haircut. And will you receive interest on the money held by the owner? Well, that's a private transaction, so you discuss it among yourself and you decide what the contract will be. In the case of private transactions between larger institutional investors, interest is usually paid on both the short proceeds and the haircut. That interest rate is called a repo rate if the property sold as a bond, and short rebate if it's a stock. It may not equal to the market rate of interest that you would otherwise receive on the funds, though, and this creates another cost to the short seller. Now, one more issue in the private transaction short selling may be the payment of dividends or any other income produced by the asset sold short. The interest rate at which such dividends or income are produced by the asset sold short is called the lease rate of the asset, or asset lease rate. Here's an example of a calculation like that. We have Eric and Jason each sell a different stock short at the beginning of the year for a price of $800. The margin requirement for each investor is 50%, and each will earn an annual effective interest rate of 8% on his margin account. It's an unusual situation of earning interest on the margin, but that's okay. You can see that you would be told this thing. Each stock pays a dividend of 16 at the end of the year. Immediately thereafter, Eric buys back his stock at a price of 800 minus 2x, so a lower price, and Jason buys back his stock at a price of 800 plus x, so higher price. Eric's annual effective yield I on the short sale is twice Jason's annual effective yield. Calculate I. So the margin deposit for both of them is 50% of 800, which is 400. And Eric's net result is the gain on the transaction, which is 2x, because he sold for 800 and bought back for 800 minus 2x. He also earns interest at 8% on 50% of 800, so 8% on 400, and that's 32. But he has to pay a dividend of 16, so we subtract that. And the answer is that this is 16 plus 2x. And Jason's net result is minus x, because there's a loss. He sold for 800 and bought back for 800 plus x, plus 32, the interest, minus 16, and that ends up being 16 minus x. And then we are told that the yield that Eric had, which is 16 plus 2x on an initial deposit of, or initial investment of 400, that's the interest rate earned. That's twice the rate earned by Jason, who put down $400 and got from the whole thing 16 minus x. So his rate of return is 16 minus x over 400 over that unit of time over which this happened. So we get this equation that 16 plus 2x over 400 is twice 16 minus x over 400, and that's a simple linear equation. We solve it for x equal to 4, and the question was, what is I, Eric's yield? And that's 16 plus 2x, or 2 times 4, over 400. That ends up being 6%. Actually not very impressive, because you can see that the risk-free interest rate in this market is the rate earned on the margin deposit, or 8%. So 6% is not that great. And that's the end of this section on discussing common stocks and short sales.